Hello everyone, welcome to another video on Ardent Word. I'm Ian, and in this video I want to really begin a series discussing what I believe and why. And a key theme is going to be the fact that I have a scientific background as well as an interest in philosophy, so reasoning as a key part of faith and one's general belief system has always been something of an important part of my life, my philosophy, and I've always wanted to be able to communicate that to other people, particularly communicating to them that the Christian belief system can actually be seen to be one that holds to reason and that is a good stance, that's not to be criticised as foolish or anything like that. So the purpose of this series, as I say, I want to present why the Christian belief system in particular, more specifically the conservative Christian belief system, as we'll see in time, is one that can be demonstrated with good reasoning. So I mentioned that I've got a background in science and philosophy, so I'll just introduce myself and give you a bit more background really for who I am. So I'm 28 years old. I'm a PhD student. My background is in environmental science, particularly in the area of hydrology, so the study of water, and most specifically in my current PhD project, it's how water in terms of hydraulics, flow forces relate to the ecosystem within rivers, and how that may be changed in order to alter the ecosystem. On top of that, I also dabble in philosophy, and I've engaged in theology ever since becoming a Christian. I became a Christian around the age of 20, so I've got a good 8 years or more of theological learning, I suppose, as I've bent quite a lot of my academic character towards that as well. So to start off my background from before I became a Christian, I was actually raised culturally as a Catholic, and thus as a child I would have identified as a Catholic just in terms of a community or an in-group, I suppose, but I was actually quite ignorant of what the belief system of the Catholic Church really was. I attended a Catholic high school, as did most of my friends. None of us really came out as good Catholics. We didn't really have any theological values taught to us. It was more just your typical social values, you know, love your neighbour, be a good person, so on and so forth. So from the age of around 13, let's say, I led a very secular life, and I gave very little thought to the higher meanings in life or the divine. And this continued until around the age of 17, when I began to actually engage with philosophical thought, the moral implications of the beliefs that I carried, why we have these beliefs and so forth. At the time I wasn't particularly well read at all in terms of philosophy or politics or anything like that. I didn't really engage in a lot of that. Honestly, I spent a lot of my time playing World of Warcraft back in them days. Oh, good times. So I was primarily influenced by contemporary atheists within entertainment, so Ricky Gervais being a good example of that, and other comedians of yesteryear such as George Carlin, who passed away around that time of my conversion to Christianity, I think, but he was still widely cited as a great atheist thinker of the time. And yet, even though I was unread and quite ignorant theologically and philosophically, I could still see these glaring issues that I perceived in the atheist worldview. But that's going to be a video for another time. But for now, let's just say I never did fully don that fedora. I didn't quite come to that tipping point, as it were. I remained an agnostic, and thus, rather than being hostile towards belief in religion, I always remained at least somewhat open-minded. And thus, as I went forward throughout sixth form, which is the stage before university, I suppose you could say, to any non-British listeners, and then into university itself, I really began to wonder about God and the issues of morality. So there were three core issues that I believe to be central and from which we can work outwards from in this series. And those are the core questions that I started with, and they're as follows. So first, and obviously most important, is there a God at all? Not specifically any kind of God, but just a divine creator. Can the universe be made more or less sense of if we acknowledge the presence of a divine creator? Question 2 would be, if there is a divine creator, then what sort of God? Which religion? Which pantheon, as it were, or is it monotheistic? And then thirdly, if we can identify what sort of God, then how does one relate to this particular God? Obviously, if they've created us and if they hold our afterlife in their hands, then surely this would be a very, very important question to be asking. So let's just start with question 1 for this video. So going back to my old beliefs and so forth before I fully became a Christian, and I was struggling with these questions, my 18 to 19-year-old self could never really quite accept the naturalist argument that God is completely made unnecessary, superfluous, due to Darwinism, for instance, or theoretical advances in science such as the Big Bang. In these naturalistic terms, I always found that this would simply lead to an infinite regress of reasoning. So you explain one causation, for example, where did the universe come from? But then you merely have another explanation to make beyond that. So as I've just said, how did the universe come about? Well, we theorise the Big Bang. How did the Big Bang happen? Well, current advancements in the area of quantum physics seems to imply that it is possible for something like the Big Bang to happen spontaneously. And then you have the question, well, where did these laws of quantum physics come from? They can't have just been sat there. And where did time come from? How can something that is supposedly timeless change and become something in time? So the questions go on. And you might call this a God of the gaps argument, inserting God into something that we've not yet been able to fully explain. But I would say that it is a starting point, and it is showing some critical thinking of the scientific process. It's not just assuming that science is always going to eventually come to the correct conclusion. I'll get to the God of the gaps argument a little more in a moment. But to continue my point, it seemed that in my generation it had become very popular to reject God in favour of science, putting across this contrived notion that God and science are forever in conflict, that one side is stupid and ignorant, and the other is informed and reasoning. Yet often this rejection didn't seem to come from a good understanding within the person themselves, be that with science, with philosophy, or even with theology, but it would come from popular writers, such as Richard Dawkins and other famous celebrities who would mock Christianity in particular, but they themselves demonstrated very little understanding of what Christianity, or even philosophy for that instance, is. Richard Dawkins is a particular culprit of this, and you can see that in any respectable intellectual circles his works are really quite widely mocked, both for their lack of nuance and for their ignorance in general of Christianity and even standard philosophical procedure. And thus, an alternative to the conflict narrative would be to appreciate that God is primarily working within the natural and not outside of it. And therefore one could be a scientist and find causal relationships within creation, and far from disproving God, these would glorify him and demonstrate his workmanship. Now, I wasn't to know this at the time, but this was the very view that's held by many respected scientists who profess the Christian faith. And at the time I just had the first inkling of this being potentially how things may be. So I must highlight that the purpose of this video isn't to prove God. It's to present the argument that belief in a God is not an unreasonable stance to have. You could always say that God can neither be proven nor disproven, but as our fedora-tipping friends like to say, well, you could just as easily say the flying spaghetti monster can neither be proven nor disproven. But this isn't the question we want to answer. The key question is this: is it a reasonable stance to believe that God in fact does exist? Does evidence point towards that? Now, more militant atheists might argue that it's never reasonable to believe in God, because science is always progressing, and they have this belief, this assumption that eventually science is going to explain everything. Now, this in itself is an unsubstantiated claim, and I think quite a dubious one, because even now you see people that don't really have much of a scientific background putting a lot of faith into what scientists say. And yes, it's very good to listen to scientists, but it's also very good to appreciate the limitations of science. And as someone that has climbed up the academic chain to the point of PhD, you do begin to see that there are quite a lot of unknowns, even in our own back gardens. As I say, my own project is looking at how flow influences little creatures in the river and how we may change that in order to benefit them, to meet government legislation. So if we don't even know how to change the flows in our own rivers to benefit ecology, how can we make assumptions that we can fully understand the vastness of the universe around us? If that is ever going to be the case, that would be millennia away if we don't destroy ourselves or something before that. So it's really a claim based on faith, to be honest, to say that we could ever fully understand or even come close to understanding the universe around us. And so this argument that whether belief in God would or would not be reasonable in a universe that is already fully understood, that's a completely separate philosophical question. Because in science, a theory is accepted either to be reasonable or not, based upon the current evidence available to it, and whether it can explain the phenomena that it addresses. For instance, the ancient Greek astronomer, Aristarchus of Samos, when he proposed his heliocentric theory of the solar system, that is, that everything revolves around the sun, he was in fact drawing the best explanation he could at the time with the evidence available to him. And it'd be very foolish to criticise him or call him an idiot for not accounting for the motions of celestial bodies that contradict this claim, when he has no access to the telescope that could have identified that sort of motion. So a lot of scientific theory is constantly evolving, and it's very reasonable to not criticise things when they're dealing with the evidence available to them at that time. And so, with the knowledge available to us at this point in time, one would ask, is the existence of God a reasonable thing to believe? So I've been winding up to this point in the video, and that is my conclusion for this video. We've set this basis of the question. Looking at what we currently know right now, would the existence of God be a reasonable thing to believe? And this is quite a big question in and of itself, and I've probably already spent a good few minutes winding up to this point, so I'll address this in a separate video. So in the next one, I'll try to argue that what we currently know in science, as well as what we can reason philosophically, does make the existence of God a reasonable stance to take. And the question following that would be, why would that lead to the Christian God? So that's the main point of this video, and in the meantime, if you're hungry for answers, there's some very good literature out there discussing this at much greater length, the issues of science, faith and reason. Two of the most notable examples for me would be the excellent Reason for God by Timothy Keller. That focuses on the philosophical reasoning for the Christian God, and also the very eloquent Inventing the Universe by Alistair McGrath, which I'm currently working through. And this tackles a question from a more scientific perspective, which is really quite fantastic to read, and any scientist, whether they be atheist, agnostic or indeed Christian, I would say that Inventing the Universe is well worth a read. But as I say, I'll come back in my next video working through why God is a reasonable thing to believe in with our current knowledge, our current science, and from there we'll discuss why I think it is reasonable to be led to the Christian God from that point. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. All the best and God bless. Cheers.